Listen and relax. Crafting serenity, one audiobook at a time.
Book 3. Conclusions. Carla Le Marchant looked up. Her eyes were full of fatigue and pain. She pushed back the hair from her forehead in a tired gesture. She said, "It's so bewildering, all this." She touched the pile of manuscripts. "Because the angle's different every time. Everybody sees my mother differently, but the facts are the same. Everyone agrees on the facts." "It has discouraged you, reading them?" "Yes. Hasn't it discouraged you?" "No. I have found these documents very valuable, very informative." Poirot spoke slowly and reflectively. Carla said, "I wish I'd never read them." Poirot looked across at her. "Ah, so it makes you feel that way?" Carla said bitterly, "Well, they all think she did it. All of them except Aunt Angela, and what she thinks doesn't count. She hasn't got any reason for it. She's just one of those loyal people who'll stick to a thing through thick and thin. She just goes on saying, Caroline couldn't have done it." "It strikes you like that?" "How else should it strike me? I've realized, that if my mother didn't do it, then one of these 5 people must have done it. I've even had theories as to why." "Ah, that is interesting. Tell me." "Oh, they were only theories. Philip Blake, for instance, he's a stockbroker. He was my father's best friend. Probably my father trusted him. And artists are usually careless about money matters. Perhaps Philip Blake was in a jam and used my father's money. He may have got my father to sign something. Then the whole thing may have been on the point of coming out, and only my father's death could have saved him. That's one of the things I thought of. Not badly imagined at all." "What else?" "Well, there's Elsa. Philip Blake says here she had her head screwed on too well to meddle with poison, but I don't think that's true at all. Supposing my mother had gone to her and told her that she wouldn't divorce my father, that nothing would induce her to divorce him. You may say what you like, but I think Elsa had a bourgeois mind. She wanted to be respectably married. I think that then Elsa would have been perfectly capable of pinching the stuff. She had just as good a chance that afternoon, and might have tried to get my mother out of the way by poisoning her. I think that would be quite like Elsa. And then, possibly by some awful accident, Amias got the stuff instead of Caroline. Again, it is not badly imagined." "What else?" Carla said slowly, "Well, I thought, perhaps, Meredith." "Ah, Meredith Blake." "Yes. You see, he sounds to me just the sort of person who would do a murder. I mean, he was the slow, dithering one the others laughed at, and underneath, perhaps he resented that. Then my father married the girl he wanted to marry, and my father was successful and rich, and Meredith did make all those poisons. Perhaps he really made them because he liked the idea of being able to kill someone one day. He had to call attention to the stuff being taken so as to divert suspicion from himself. But he himself was far the most likely person to have taken it. He might even have liked getting Caroline hanged, because she turned him down long ago. I think, it's rather fishy what he says in his account of it all. How people do things that aren't characteristic of them. Supposing he meant himself when he wrote that." Hercule Poirot said, "You are at least right in this, not to take what has been written down as necessarily a true narrative. What has been written may have been written deliberately to mislead." "Oh, I know. I've kept that in mind." "Any other ideas?" Carla said slowly, "I wondered, before I'd read this, about Miss Williams. She lost her job, you see, when Angela went to school. And if Amias had died suddenly, Angela probably wouldn't have gone after all. I mean, if it passed off as a natural death, which it easily might have done, I suppose, if Meredith hadn't missed the conniving. I read up conniving, and it hasn't got any distinctive post-mortem appearances. It might have been thought to be sunstroke. I know that just losing a job doesn't sound a very adequate motive for murder, but murders have been committed again and again for what seem ridiculously inadequate motives. Tiny sums of money sometimes, and a middle-aged, perhaps rather incompetent governess might have got the wind up and just seen no future ahead of her. As I say, that's what I thought before I read this, but Miss Williams doesn't sound like that at all. She doesn't sound in the least incompetent. Not at all. She is still a very efficient and intelligent woman. I know, one can see that. And she sounds absolutely trustworthy, too. That's what has upset me, really. Oh, you know. You understand. You don't mind, of course. All along you've made it clear it was the truth you wanted. I suppose now we've got the truth. Miss Williams is quite right. One must accept truth. It's no good basing your life on a lie because it's what you want to believe. All right, then. I can take it. My mother wasn't innocent. She wrote me that letter because she was weak and unhappy and wanted to spare me. I don't judge her. Perhaps I should feel like that too. I don't know what prison does to you, and I don't blame her either. If she felt so desperately about my father, I suppose she couldn't help herself. But I don't blame my father altogether either. I understand just a little how he felt. So alive, so full of wanting everything. He couldn't help it. He was made that way, and he was a great painter. I think that excuses a lot. She turned her flushed, excited face to Hercule Poirot with her chin raised defiantly. Hercule Poirot said, "So, you are satisfied?" "Satisfied?" said Carla the Marchant. Her voice broke on the word. Poirot leant forward and patted her paternally on the shoulder. "Listen," he said. "You give up the fight at the moment when it is most worth fighting. At the moment when I, Hercule Poirot, have a very good idea of what really happened." Carla stared at him. She said, "Miss Williams loved my mother. She saw her, with her own eyes, faking that suicide evidence. If you believe what she says," Hercule Poirot got up. He said, "Mademoiselle, because Cecilia Williams says she saw your mother faking Amias Creel's fingerprints on the beer bottle, mind, that is the only thing I need to tell me definitely, once and for all, that your mother did not kill your father." He nodded his head several times and went out of the room, leaving Carla staring after him. Poirot asks 5 questions. 1. "Well, Monsieur Poirot?" Philip Blake's tone was impatient. Poirot said, "I have to thank you for your admirable and lucid account of the Creil tragedy." Philip Blake looked rather self-conscious. "Oh, very kind of you," he murmured. "Really surprising how much I remembered when I got down to it." Poirot said, "It was an admirably clear narrative, but there were certain omissions, were there not?" "Omissions?" Philip Blake frowned. Hercule Poirot said, "Your narrative, shall we say, was not entirely frank." His tone hardened. "I have been informed, Monsieur Blake, that on at least one night during the summer, Mrs. Creil was seen coming out of your room at a somewhat compromising hour." There was a silence, broken only by Philip Blake's heavy breathing. He said at last, "Who told you that?" Hercule Poirot shook his head. "It is no matter who told me. That I know. That is the point." Again there was a silence. Then Philip Blake made up his mind. He said, "By accident, it seems, you have stumbled upon a purely private matter. I admit that it does not square with what I have written down. Nevertheless, it squares better than you might think. I am forced now to tell you the truth. I did entertain a feeling of animosity towards Caroline Creil. At the same time, I was always strongly attracted by her. Perhaps the latter fact induced the former. I resented the power she had over me, and tried to stifle the attraction she had for me by constantly dwelling on her worst points. I never liked her, you understand, but it would have been easy at any moment for me to make love to her. I had been in love with her as a boy, and she had taken no notice of me. I did not find that easy to forgive. My opportunity came when Amias lost his head so completely over the Greer girl. Quite without meaning to, I found myself telling Caroline I loved her. She said quite calmly, "Yes, I've always known that." The insolence of the woman. Of course, I knew that she didn't love me, but I saw that she was disturbed and disillusioned by Amias's present infatuation. That is a mood when a woman can very easily be won. She agreed to come to me that night, and she came. Blake paused. He found now a difficulty in getting the words out. She came to my room, and then, with my arms round her, she told me quite coolly that it was no good. After all, she said, she was a one-man woman. She was Amias Creil's, for better or worse. She agreed that she had treated me very badly, but said she couldn't help it. She asked me to forgive her. And she left me. She left me. Do you wonder, Monsieur Poirot, that my hatred of her was heightened 100-fold? Do you wonder that I've never forgiven her for the insult she did me, as well as for the fact that she killed the friend I loved better than anyone in the world? Trembling violently, Philip Blake exclaimed, "I don't want to speak of it. Do you hear? You've got your answer, now go, and never mention the matter to me again." 2. I want to know, Monsieur Blake, the order in which your guests left the laboratory that day. Meredith Blake protested. "But my dear Monsieur Poirot, after 16 years, how can I possibly remember? I've told you that Caroline came out last. You are sure of that?" "Yes, at least, I think so." "Let us go there now. We must be quite sure, you see." Still protesting, Meredith Blake led the way. He unlocked the door and swung back the shutters. Poirot spoke to him authoritatively. "Now then, my friend, you have showed your visitors your interesting preparations of herbs. Shut your eyes now and think." Meredith Blake did so obediently. Poirot drew a handkerchief from his pocket and gently passed it to and fro. Blake murmured, his nostrils twitching slightly. Yes, extraordinary how things come back to one. Caroline, I remember, had on a pale, coffee-coloured dress. Phil was looking bored. He always thought my hobby was quite idiotic. Poirot said, "Reflect now. You are about to leave the room. You are going to the library, where you are going to read the passage about the death of Socrates. Who leaves the room first? Do you?" "Elsa and I. Yes. She passed through the door first. I was close behind her. We were talking. I stood there waiting for the others to come out so I could lock the door again. Philip. Yes, Philip came out next. And Angela. She was asking him what bulls and bears were. They went on through the hall. Amias followed them. I stood there waiting, still. For Caroline, of course." "So you are quite sure Caroline stayed behind? Did you see what she was doing?" Blake shook his head. "No, I had my back to the room, you see. I was talking to Elsa, boring her, I expect, telling her how certain plants must be gathered at the full moon according to old superstition. And then Caroline came out, hurrying a little, and I locked the door." He stopped and looked at Poirot, who was replacing a handkerchief in his pocket. Meredith Blake sniffled disgustedly and thought, "Why, the fellow actually uses scent." Aloud he said, "I am quite sure of it. That was the order. Elsa, myself, Philip, Angela, and Caroline. Does that help you at all?" Marlowe said, "It all fits in. Listen, I want to arrange a meeting here. It will not, I think, be difficult." 3. "Well," Elsa Dittisham said it almost eagerly, like a child, "I want to ask you a question, madam." "Yes?" Poirot said, "After it was all over, the trial, I mean, did Meredith Blake ask you to marry him?" Elsa stared. She looked contemptuous, almost bored. "Yes, he did." "Why? Were you surprised?" "Was I? I don't remember." "What did you say?" Elsa laughed. She said, "What do you think I said? After Amias? Meredith? It would have been ridiculous. It was stupid of him. He was always rather stupid." She smiled suddenly. "He wanted, you know, to protect me, to look after me. That's how he put it. He thought, like everyone else, that the assizes had been a terrible ordeal for me, and the reporters, and the booing crowds, and all the mud that was slung at me." She brooded a minute. Then she said, "Poor old Meredith. Such an ass," and laughed again. 4. Once again, Hercule Poirot encountered the shrewd, penetrating glance of Miss Williams, and once again felt the years falling away, and himself a meek and apprehensive little boy. There was, he explained, a question he wished to ask. Miss Williams intimated her willingness to hear what the question was. Poirot said slowly, picking his words carefully, "Angela Warren was injured as a very young child. In my notes, I find 2 references to that fact. In one of them, it is stated that Mrs. Crail threw a paperweight at the child. In the other, that she attacked the baby with a crowbar. Which of those versions is the right one?" Miss Williams replied briskly, "I never heard anything about a crowbar. The paperweight is the correct story. Who was your own informant?" "Angela herself. She volunteered the information quite early." "What did she say exactly?" "Well, she touched her cheek and said, 'Caroline did this when I was a baby. She threw a paperweight at me. Never refer to it, will you, because it upsets her dreadfully.'" "Did Mrs. Crail herself ever mention the matter to you?" "Only obliquely. She assumed that I knew the story. I remember her once saying, 'I know you think I spoil Angela, but you see, I always feel there is nothing I can do to make up to her for what I did.' And on another occasion she said, 'To know you have permanently injured another human being is the heaviest burden anyone could have to bear.'" "Thank you, Miss Williams. That is all I wanted to know." Cecilia Williams said sharply, "I don't understand you, Monsieur Poirot. You showed Carla my account of the tragedy." Poirot nodded. "And yet you are still—" She stopped. Poirot said, "Reflect a minute. If you were to pass a fishmonger's and saw 12 fish laid out on his slab, you would think they were all real fish, would you not? But one of them might be a stuffed fish." Miss Williams replied with spirit, "Most unlikely. And anyway, unlikely, yes, but not impossible. Because a friend of mine once took down a stuffed fish. It was his trade, you comprehend, to compare it with the real thing, and if you saw a bowl of Indians in a drawing room in December, you would say that they were false. But they might be real ones, flown home from Baghdad." "What is the meaning of all this nonsense?" demanded Miss Williams. "It is to show you that it is the eyes of the mind with which one really sees." 5. Poirot slowed up a little as he approached the big block of flats overlooking Regent's Park. Really, when he came to think of it, he did not want to ask Angela Warren any questions at all. The only question he did want to ask her could wait. No, it was really only his insatiable passion for symmetry that was bringing him here. 5 people. There should be 5 questions. It was neater so. It rounded off the thing better. Ah well, he would think of something. Angela Warren greeted him with something closely approaching eagerness. She said, "Have you found out anything? Have you got anywhere?" Slowly, Poirot nodded his head in his best China Mandarin manner. He said, "At last, I make progress. Philip Blake?" It was halfway between a statement and a question. "Mademoiselle, I do not wish to say anything at present. The moment has not come yet. What I will ask of you is to be so good as to come down to Handcross Manor. The others have consented." She said with a slight frown, "What do you propose to do? Reconstruct something that happened 16 years ago? See it perhaps from a clearer angle. You will come?" Angela Warren said slowly, "Oh yes, I'll come. It will be interesting to see all those people again. I shall see them now, perhaps, from a clearer angle, as you put it, than I did then." "And you will bring with you the letter that you showed me?" Angela Warren frowned. "That letter is my own. I showed it to you for a good and sufficient reason, but I have no intention of allowing it to be read by strange and unsympathetic persons." "But you will allow yourself to be guided by me in this matter?" "I will do nothing of the kind. I will bring the letter with me, but I shall use my own judgment, which I venture to think is quite as good as yours." Poirot spread out his hands in a gesture of resignation. He got up to go. He said, "Do you permit that I ask one little question?" "What is it?" "At the time of the tragedy, you had lately read, had you not, Somerset Maugham's The Moon and Sixpence?" Angela stared at him. Then she said, "I believe... why, yes, that is quite true." She looked at him with frank curiosity. "How did you know?" "I want to show you, mademoiselle, that even in a small, unimportant matter, I am something of a magician." There are things I know without having to be told. Reconstruction. The afternoon sun shone into the laboratory at Hancross Manor. Some easy chairs and a settee had been brought into the room, but they served more to emphasize its forlorn aspect than to furnish it. Slightly embarrassed, pulling at his moustache, Meredith Blake talked to Carla in a desultory way. He broke off once to say, "My dear, you are very like your mother, and yet unlike her too." Carla asked, "How am I like her, and how unlike?" "You have her colouring and her way of moving, but you are, how shall I put it, more positive than she ever was." Philip Blake, a scowl creasing over his forehead, looked out of the window and drummed impatiently on the pane. He said, "What's the sense of all this? A perfectly fine Saturday afternoon." Hercule Poirot hastened to pour oil on troubled waters. "I apologize. It is, I know, unpardonable to disarrange the golf. Mais voyons. Monsieur Blake, this is the daughter of your best friend. You will stretch a point for her, will you not?" The butler announced, "Miss Warren." Meredith went to welcome her. He said, "It's good of you to spare the time, Angela. You're busy, I know." He led her over to the window. Carla said, "Hello, Aunt Angela. I read your article in the Times this morning. It's nice to have a distinguished relative." She indicated the tall, square-jawed young man with the steady grey eyes. "This is John Rattery. He and I hope to be married." Angela Warren said, "Oh, I didn't know." Meredith went to greet the next arrival. "Well, Miss Williams, it's a good many years since we met." Thin, frail, and indomitable, the elderly governess advanced up the room. Her eyes rested thoughtfully on Poirot for a minute. Then they went to the tall, square-shouldered figure in the well-cut tweeds. Angela Warren came forward to meet her and said with a smile, "I feel like a schoolgirl again." "I am very proud of you, my dear," said Miss Williams. "You've done me credit. This is Carla, I suppose. She won't remember me. She was too young." Philip Blake said fretfully, "What is all this?" "Nobody told me," Hercule Poirot said. "I call it me an excursion into the past. Shall we not all sit down? Then we shall be ready when the last guest arrives, and when she is here we can proceed to our business, to lay the ghosts." Philip Blake exclaimed, "What tomfoolery is this? You're not going to hold a séance, are you?" No. We are only going to discuss some events that happened long ago, to discuss them and perhaps to see more clearly the cause of it. As to the ghosts, they will not materialize. But who is to say they are not here, in this room, although we cannot see them? Who is to say that Amias and Caroline Crail are not here, listening? Philip Blake said, "Absurd nonsense," and broke off as the door opened again, and the butler announced Lady Dittisham. Elsa Dittisham came in with that faint, bored insolence that was a characteristic of her. She gave Meredith a slight smile, stared coldly at Angela and Philip, and went over to a chair by the window, a little apart from the others. She loosened the rich, pale furs round her neck and let them fall back. She looked for a minute or two about the room, then at Carla, and the girl stared back, thoughtfully appraising the woman who had wrought the havoc in her parents' lives. There was no animosity in her young, earnest face, only curiosity. Elsa said, "I'm sorry if I'm late, Monsieur Poirot. It is very good of you to come, madame." Cecilia Williams snorted ever so slightly. Elsa met the animosity in her eyes with a complete lack of interest. She said, "I wouldn't have known you, Angela. How long is it? 16 years? Hercule Poirot seized this opportunity. "Yes, it is 16 years since the events of which we are to speak. But let me first tell you why we are here." And in a few simple words he outlined Carla's appeal to him and his acceptance of the task. He went on quickly, ignoring the gathering storm visible on Philip's face and the shocked distaste on Meredith's. "I accepted that commission. I set to work to find out the truth." Carla the Marchant, in the big grandfather chair, heard Poirot's words dimly from a distance. With her hand shielding her eyes, she studied 5 faces surreptitiously. Could she see any of these people committing murder? The exotic Elsa, the red-faced Philip, dear, nice, kind Mr. Meredith Blake, that grim Tartar of a governess, the cool, competent Angela Warren. Could she, if she tried hard, visualize one of them killing someone? Yes, perhaps, but it wouldn't be the right kind of murder. She could picture Philip Blake in an outburst of fury strangling some women. Yes, she could picture that. And she could picture Meredith Blake threatening a burglar with a revolver and letting it off by accident. And she could picture Angela Warren also firing a revolver, but not by accident. With no personal feeling in the matter, the safety of the expedition depended on it. And Elsa, in some fantastic castle, saying from her couch of oriental silks, "Throw the wretch over the battlements." All wild fancies, and not even in the wildest flight of fancy could she imagine little Miss Williams killing anybody at all. Another fantastic picture. Did you ever kill anybody, Miss Williams? Go on with your arithmetic, Carla, and don't ask silly questions. To kill anybody is very wicked. Carla thought, I must be ill, I must stop this. Listen, you fool. Listen to that little man who says he knows. Hercule Poirot was talking. That was my task, to put myself in reverse gear, as it were, to go back through the years and discover what really happened. Philip Blake said, "We all know what happened. To pretend anything else is a swindle. That's what it is, a barefaced swindle. You're getting money out of this girl on false pretenses." Poirot did not allow himself to be angered. He said, "You say we all know what happened. You speak without reflection. The accepted version of certain facts is not necessarily the true one. On the face of it, for instance, you, Monsieur Blake, disliked Caroline Crail. That is the accepted version of your attitude. But anyone with the least flair for psychology can perceive at once that the exact opposite was the truth. You were always violently attracted towards Caroline Crail. You resented the facts, and tried to conquer it by steadfastly telling yourself her defects and reiterating your dislike. In the same way, Mr. Meredith Blake had a tradition of devotion to Caroline Crail lasting over many years. In his story of the tragedy, he represents himself as resenting Amias Crail's conduct on her account. But you only have to read carefully between the lines, and you will see that the devotion of a lifetime had worn itself thin, and that it was the young, beautiful Elsa Greer that was occupying his mind and thoughts." There was a splutter from Meredith, and Lady Dittisham smiled. Marlowe went on, "I mention these matters only as illustrations, though they have their bearing on what happened. Very well. I start on my backward journey to learn everything I can about the tragedy. I will tell you how I set about it. I talked to the counsel who defended Caroline Crail, to the junior counsel for the Crown, to the old solicitor who had known the Crail family intimately, to the lawyer's clerk who had been in court during the trial, to the police officer in charge of the case, and I came finally to the 5 eyewitnesses who had been upon the scene. And from all of these, I put together a picture, a composite picture of a woman, and I learned these facts. That at no time did Caroline Crail protest her innocence, except in that one letter written to her daughter. That Caroline Crail showed no fear in the dock, that she showed in fact hardly any interest, that she adopted throughout a thoroughly defeatist attitude, that in prison she was quiet and serene, that in a letter she wrote to her sister immediately after the verdict, she expressed herself as acquiescent in the fate that had overtaken her. And in the opinion of everyone I talked to, with one notable exception, Caroline Crail was guilty." Philip Blake nodded his head. "Well, of course she was," Hercule Poirot said, "but it was not my part to accept the verdict of others. I had to examine the evidence for myself, to examine the facts and to satisfy myself that the psychology of the case accorded itself with them. To do this, I went over the police files carefully, and I also succeeded in getting 5 people who were on the spot to write me out their own accounts of the tragedy. These accounts were very valuable, for they contained certain matter which the police files could not give me. That is to say, A. Certain conversations and incidents which from the police point of view were not relevant. B. The opinions of the people themselves as to what Caroline Creel was thinking and feeling, not admissible legally as evidence. C. Certain facts which had been deliberately withheld from the police. I was now in a position to judge the case for myself. There seems no doubt whatever that Caroline Creel had ample motive for the crime. She loved her husband. He had publicly admitted that he was about to leave her for another woman, and by her own admission, she was a jealous woman. To come from motives to means. An empty scent bottle that had contained quinine was found in her bureau drawer. There were no fingerprints upon it but hers. When asked about it by the police, she admitted taking it from this room we are in now. The quinine bottle here also had her fingerprints on it. I questioned Monsieur Meredith Blake as to the order in which the 5 people left this room on that day, for it seemed to me hardly conceivable that any one should be able to help themselves to the poison whilst 5 people were in the room. The people left the room in this order: Elsa Gray, Meredith Blake, Angela Warren, and Philip Blake, Amias Creel, and lastly, Caroline Creel. Moreover, Monsieur Meredith Blake has his back to the room whilst he was waiting for Mrs. Creel to come out, so that it was impossible for him to see what she was doing. She had, that is to say, the opportunity. I am therefore satisfied that she did take the quinine. There is indirect confirmation of it. Monsieur Meredith Blake said to me the other day, "I can remember standing here and smelling the jasmine through the open window." But the month was September, and the jasmine creeper outside that window would have finished flowering. It is the ordinary jasmine which blooms in June and July. But the scent bottle found in her room, and which contained the dregs of quinine, had originally contained jasmine scent. I take it as certain, then, that Mrs. Creel decided to steal the quinine, and surreptitiously emptied out the scent from a bottle she had in her bag. I tested that a second time the other day when I asked Monsieur Blake to shut his eyes and try to remember the order of leaving the room. A whiff of jasmine scent stimulated his memory immediately. We are all more influenced by smell than we know. So, we come to the morning of the fatal day. So far, the facts are not in dispute. Miss Greer's sudden revealing of the fact that she and Mr. Creel contemplate marriage. Amias Creel's confirmation of that, and Caroline Creel's deep distress. None of these things depend on the evidence of one witness only. On the following morning, there is a scene between husband and wife in the library. The first thing that is overheard is Caroline Creel saying, "You and your women," in a bitter voice, and finally going on to say, "Someday I'll kill you." Philip Blake overheard this from the hall, and Miss Greer overheard it from the terrace outside. She then heard Monsieur Creel ask his wife to be reasonable, and she heard Mrs. Creel say, "Sooner than let you go to that girl, I'll kill you." Soon after this, Amias Creel comes out and brusquely tells Elsa Greer to come down and pose for him. She gets a pullover and accompanies him. There is nothing so far that seems psychologically incorrect. Everyone has behaved as they might be expected to behave. But now, we come to something that is incongruous. Meredith Blake discovers his loss, telephones his brother. They meet down at the landing stage, and they come up past the Battery Garden, where Caroline Creel is having a discussion with her husband on the subject of Angela's going to school. Now that does strike me as very odd. Husband and wife have a terrific scene, ending in a distinct threat on Caroline's part. And yet, 20 minutes or so later, she goes down and starts a trivial domestic argument. Poirot turned to Meredith Blake. "You speak in your narrative of certain words you overheard Creel say. These were, 'It's all settled.' I'll see to her packing, that is right? Meredith Blake said, It was something like that, yes. Poirot turned to Philip Blake. Is your recollection the same? The latter frowned. Well, I didn't remember it till you say so, but I do remember now. Something was said about packing. Said by Monsieur Crail, not Mrs. Crail. Amaya said it. All I heard Caroline say was something about its being very hard on the girl. Anyway, what does all this matter? We all know Angela was off to school in a day or two. Poirot said, You do not see the force of my objection. Why should Amias Crail pack for the girl? It is absurd. There was Mrs. Crail, there was Miss Williams, there was a housemaid. It is a woman's job to pack, not a man's. Philip Blake said impatiently, What does it matter? It's nothing to do with the crime. You think not? For me, it was the first point that struck me as suggestive. And it is immediately followed by another. Mrs. Crail, a desperate woman, broken-hearted, who has threatened her husband a short while before, and who is certainly contemplating either suicide or murder, now offers in the most amicable manner to bring her husband down some iced beer. Meredith Blake said slowly, That isn't odd if she was contemplating murder. Then surely it is just what she would do. Dissimulate. You think so? She has decided to poison her husband. She has already got the poison. Her husband keeps a supply of beer down in the Battery garden. Surely, if she has any intelligence at all, she will put the poison in one of those bottles, at a moment when there is no one above. Meredith Blake objected. She couldn't have done that. Somebody else might have drunk it. Yes, Elsa Greer. Do you tell me that having made up her mind to murder her husband, Caroline Crail would have scruples against killing that girl, too? But let us not argue the point. Let us confine ourselves to facts. Caroline Crail says she will send her husband down some iced beer. She goes up to the house, fetches a bottle from the conservatory where it was kept, and takes it down to him. She pours it out and gives it him. Amias Crail drinks it off and says, Everything tastes foul today. Mrs. Crail goes up again to the house. She has lunch and appears much as usual. It has been said of her that she looks a little worried and preoccupied. That does not help us, for there is no criterion of behavior for a murderer. There are calm murderers and excited murderers. After lunch, she goes down again to the Battery. She discovers her husband dead, and does, shall we say, the obviously expected things. She registers emotion, and she sends the governess to telephone for a doctor. We now come to a fact which has previously not been known. He looked at Miss Williams. You do not object? Miss Williams was rather pale. She said, I did not pledge you to secrecy. Quietly, but with telling effect, Poirot recounted what the governess had seen. Elsa Dittisham moved her position. She stared at the drab little woman in the big chair. She said incredibly, You actually saw her do that? Philip Blake sprang up. But that settles it, he shouted. That settles it once and for all. Hercule Poirot looked at him mildly. He said, Not necessarily. Angela Warren said sharply, I don't believe it. There was a quick, hostile glint in the glance she shot at the little governess. Meredith Blake was pulling at his moustache, his face dismayed. Alone, Miss Williams remained undisturbed. She sat very upright, and there was a spot of colour in each cheek. She said, That is what I saw. Poirot said slowly, There is, of course, only your word for it. There is only my word for it? The indomitable grey eyes met his. I am not accustomed, Monsieur Poirot, to having my word doubted. Hercule Poirot bowed his head. He said, I do not doubt your word, Miss Williams. What you saw took place exactly as you say it did. And because of what you saw, I realized that Caroline Crail was not guilty, could not possibly be guilty. For the first time, that tall, anxious-faced young man, John Rattery, spoke. He said, I'd be interested to know why you say that, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot turned to him. Certainly. I will tell you. What did Miss Williams see? She saw Caroline Crail very carefully and anxiously wiping off fingerprints and subsequently imposing her dead husband's fingerprints on the beer bottle. on the beer bottle mark. But the quinine was in the glass, not in the bottle. The police found no traces of quinine in the bottle. There had never been any quinine in the bottle, and Caroline Crail didn't know that. She, who is supposed to have poisoned her husband, did not know how he had been poisoned. She thought the poison was in the bottle. Meredith objected. But why? Poirot interrupted him in a flash. Yes, why? Why did Caroline Crail try so desperately to establish the theory of suicide? The answer must be, quite simple. Because she knew who had poisoned him, and she was willing to do anything, endure anything, rather than let that person be suspected. There is not far to go. Who could that person be? Would she have shielded Philip Blake? Or Meredith? Or Elsa Greer? Or Cecilia Williams? No. There is only one person whom she would be willing to protect at all costs. He paused. Miss Warren, if you have brought your sister's last letter with you, I should like to read it aloud. Angela Warren said, No. But, Miss Warren. Angela got up. Her voice rang out, cold as steel. I realize very well what you are suggesting. You were saying, are you not, that I killed Amias Crail, and that my sister knew it. I deny that allegation utterly. Poirot said, The letter. That letter was meant for my eyes alone. Poirot looked where the two youngest people in the room stood together. Carla Le Marchant said, Please, Aunt Angela, won't you do as Monsieur Poirot asks? Angela Warren said bitterly, Really, Carla, have you no sense of decency? She was your mother, you... Carla's voice rang out clear and fierce. Yes, she was my mother. That's why I've a right to ask you. I'm speaking for her. I want that letter read. Slowly, Angela Warren took out the letter from her bag and handed it to Poirot. She said bitterly, I wish I'd never shown it to you. Turning away from them, she stood looking out of the window. As Hercule Poirot read aloud Caroline Crail's last letter, the shadows were deepening in the corners of the room. Carla had a sudden feeling of someone in the room, gathering shape, listening, breathing, waiting. She thought, She's here. My mother's here. Caroline Crail is here, in this room. Hercule Poirot's voice ceased. He said, You will all agree, I think, that that is a very remarkable letter. A beautiful letter, too, but certainly remarkable. For there is one striking omission in it. It contains no protestation of innocence. Angela Warren said, without turning her head, That was unnecessary. Yes, Miss Warren, it was unnecessary. Caroline Crail had no need to tell her sister that she was innocent, because she thought her sister knew the fact already, knew it for the best of all reasons. All Caroline Crail was concerned about was to comfort and reassure and to avert the possibility of a confession from Angela. She reiterates again and again, It's all right, darling. It is all right. Angela Warren said, Can't you understand? She wanted me to be happy, that's all. Yes, she wanted you to be happy. That is abundantly clear. It is her one preoccupation. She has a child. But it is not that child of whom she is thinking. That is to come later. No. It is her sister who occupies her mind to the exclusion of everything else. Her sister must be reassured, must be encouraged to live her life, to be happy and successful. So that the burden of acceptance may not be too great, Caroline includes that one very significant phrase, One must pay one's debt. That one phrase explains everything. It refers explicitly to the burden that Caroline has carried for so many years, ever since in a fit of uncontrolled adolescent rage she hurled a paperweight at her baby sister and injured that sister for life. Now, at last, she has the opportunity to pay the debt she owes. And if it is any consolation, I will say to you all that I earnestly believe that in the payment of that debt, Caroline Crail did achieve a peace and serenity greater than any she had ever known. Because of her belief that she was paying that debt, the ordeal of trial and condemnation could not touch her. It is a strange thing to say of a condemned murderess, but she had everything to make her happy. Yes, more than you imagine, as I will show you presently. See how, by this explanation, everything falls into its place where Caroline's own reactions are concerned. Look at the series of events from her point of view. To begin with, on the preceding evening, an event occurs which reminds her forcibly of her own undisciplined girlhood. Angela throws a paperweight at Amias Craig. That, remember, is what she herself did many years ago. Angela shouts out that she wishes Amias was dead. Then on the next morning, Caroline comes into the little conservatory and finds Angela tampering with the beer. Remember Miss Williams' words? Angela was there. She looked guilty. Guilty of playing truant was what Miss Williams meant. But to Caroline, Angela's guilty face as she was caught unawares would have a different meaning. Remember that on at least one occasion before, Angela had put things in Amias's drink. It was an idea which might readily occur to her. Caroline takes the bottle that Angela gives her and goes down with it to the battery. And there she pours it out and gives it to Amias. And he makes a face as he tosses it off and utters those significant words, "Everything tastes foul today." Caroline has no suspicions. But after lunch, she goes down to the battery and finds her husband dead. And she has no doubt at all but that he has been poisoned. She has not done it. Who then has? And the whole thing comes over her with a rush. Angela's threats, Angela's face stooping over the beer and caught unawares, guilty, guilty, guilty. Why has the child done it? As a revenge on Amias? Perhaps not meaning to kill, just to make him ill or sick. Or has she done it for her, Caroline's sake? Has she realized and resented Amias's desertion of her sister? Caroline remembers, oh, so well, her own undisciplined, violent emotions at Angela's age, and only one thought springs to her mind. How can she protect Angela? Angela handled that bottle. Angela's fingerprints will be on it. She quickly wipes it and polishes it. If only everybody can be got to believe it is suicide. If Amias's fingerprints are the only ones found. She tries to fit his dead fingers round the bottle, working desperately, listening for someone to come. Once take that assumption as true, and everything from then on fits it. Her anxiety about Angela all along, her insistence on getting her away, keeping her out of touch with what was going on, her fear of Angela's being questioned unduly by the police. Finally, her overwhelming anxiety to get Angela out of England before the trial comes on. Because she is always terrified that Angela might break down and confess. Truth. Slowly, Angela Warren swung round. Her eyes, hard and contemptuous, ranged over the faces turned towards her. She said, "You're blind fools, all of you. Don't you know that if I had done it, I would have confessed? I'd never have let Caroline suffer for what I'd done. Never." Poirot said, "But you did tamper with the beer." "I? Tamper with the beer?" Poirot turned to Meredith Blake. "Listen, monsieur. In your account here of what happened, you describe having heard sounds in this room, which is below your bedroom, on the morning of the crime." Blake nodded. "But it was only a cat. How do you know it was a cat?" I can't remember, but it was a cat. I'm quite sure it was a cat. The window was open just wide enough for a cat to get through. But it was not fixed in that position. The sash moves freely. It could have been pushed up and down, and a human being could have got in and out." "Yes, but I know it was a cat." "You did not see a cat?" Blake said perplexedly and slowly, "No, I did not see it." He paused, frowning. "And yet, I know." "I will tell you why you know presently. In the meantime, I put this point out. Someone could have come up to the house that morning, have got into your laboratory, taken something from the shelf, and gone again without your seeing them. Now, if that someone had come over from Alderby, It could not have been Philip Blake, nor Elsa Greer, nor Amias Crail, nor Caroline Crail. We know quite well what all those four were doing. That leaves Angela Warren and Miss Williams. Miss Williams was over here. You actually met her as you went out. She told you then that she was looking for Angela. Angela had gone bathing early, but Miss Williams did not see her in the water, nor anywhere on the rocks. She could swim across to this side easily. In fact, she did so later in the morning, when she was bathing with Philip Blake. I suggest that she swam across here, came up to the house, got in through the window, and took something from the shelf. Angela Warren said, I did nothing of the kind. Not, at least... Ah! Poirot gave a yelp of triumph. You have remembered. You told me, did you not, that to play a malicious joke on Amias Crail, you pinched some of what you called the cat stuff. That is how you put it. Meredith Blake said sharply, Valerian, of course! Exactly. That is what made you sure in your mind that it was a cat who had been in the room. Your nose is very sensitive. You smelled the faint, unpleasant odor of valerian without knowing perhaps that you did so. But it suggested to your subconscious mind, cat. Cats love valerian and will go anywhere for it. Valerian is particularly nasty to taste, and it was your account of it the day before which made mischievous Miss Angela plan to put some in her brother-in-law's beer, which she knew he always tossed down his throat in a draught. Angela Warren said wonderingly, Was it really that day? I remember taking it perfectly, yes, and I remember getting out the beer and Caroline coming in and nearly catching me. Of course I remember, but I've never connected it with that particular day. Of course not, because there was no connection in your mind. The two events were entirely dissimilar. One was on a par with other mischievous pranks. The other was a bombshell of tragedy, arriving without warning, and succeeding in banishing all lesser incidents from your mind. But me, I noticed when you spoke of it that you said, I pinched the valerian to put it in Amias's drink. You did not say you had actually done so. Well, no, because I never did. Caroline came in just when I was unscrewing the bottle. Oh, it was a cry. And Caroline thought it was me. She stopped. She looked round. She said quietly, in her usual cool tones, I suppose you all think so too. She paused and then said, I didn't kill Amias. Not as the result of a malicious joke, nor in any other way. If I had, I would never have kept silence. Miss Williams said sharply, Of course you wouldn't, my dear. She looked at Hercule Poirot. Nobody but a fool would think so. Hercule Poirot said mildly, I am not a fool, and I do not think so. I know quite well who killed Amias Crail. There is always a danger of accepting facts as proved, which are really nothing of the kind. Let us take the situation at Audiobook. A very old situation. 2 women and 1 man. We have taken it for granted that Amias Crail proposed to leave his wife for the other woman. But I suggest to you now that he never intended to do anything of the kind. He had had infatuations for women before. They obsessed him while they lasted, but they were soon over. The women he had fallen in love with were usually women of a certain experience. They did not expect too much of him. But this time the woman did. She was not, you see, a woman at all. She was a girl. And in Caroline Crail's words, she was terribly sincere. She may have been hard-boiled and sophisticated in speech, but in love she was frighteningly single-minded. Because she herself had a deep and overmastering passion for Amias Crail, she assumed that he had the same for her. She assumed without any question that their passion was for life. She assumed without asking him that he was going to leave his wife. But why, you will say, did Amias Crail not undeceive her? And my answer is the picture. He wanted to finish his picture. To some people that sounds incredible, but not to anybody who knows about artists. And we have already accepted that explanation in principle. That conversation between Crail and Meredith Blake is more intelligible now. Crail is embarrassed, pats Blake on the back, assures him optimistically the whole thing is going to pan out all right. To Amias Crail, you see, everything is simple. He is painting a picture, slightly encumbered by what he describes as a couple of jealous, neurotic women, but neither of them is going to be allowed to interfere with what to him is the most important thing in life. If he were to tell Elsa the truth, it would be all up with the picture. Perhaps in the first flush of his feelings for her, he did talk about leaving Caroline. Men do say these things when they are in love. Perhaps he merely let it be assumed, as he is letting it be assumed now. He doesn't care what Elsa assumes. Let her think what she likes, anything to keep her quiet for another day or two. Then he will tell her the truth, that things between them are over. He has never been a man to be troubled with scruples. He did, I think, make an effort not to get embroiled with Elsa to begin with. He warned her what kind of a man he was, but she would not take warning. She rushed on her fate. And to a man like Crail, women were fair game. If you had asked him, he would have said easily that Elsa was young, she'd soon get over it. That was the way Amias Crail's mind worked. His wife was actually the only person he cared about at all. He wasn't worrying much about her. She'd only got to put up with things for a few days longer. He was furious with Elsa for blurting out things to Caroline, but he still optimistically thought it would be all right. Caroline would forgive him, just as she had done so often before, and Elsa would just have to lump it. So simple are the problems of life to a man like Amias Crail. But I think that last evening he became really worried about Caroline, not about Elsa. Perhaps he went to her room, and she refused to speak with him. At any rate, after a restless night, he took her aside after breakfast and blurted out the truth. He had been infatuated with Elsa, but it was all over. Once he'd finished the picture, he'd never see her again. And it was in answer to that Caroline Crail cried out indignantly, "You and your women!" That phrase, you see, put Elsa in a class with others, those who had gone their way. And she added indignantly, "Someday I'll kill you." She was angry, revolted by his callousness and by his cruelty to the girl, when Philip Blake saw her in the hall and heard her murmur to herself, "It's too cruel." It was of Elsa she was thinking. As for Crail, he came out of the library, found Elsa with Philip Blake, and brusquely ordered her down to go on with the city. What he did not know was that Elsa Greer had been sitting just outside the library window and overheard everything. And the account she gave later of that conversation was not the true one. There is only her word for it, remember. Imagine the shock it must have been to her to hear the truth, brutally spoken. On the previous afternoon, Meredith Blake has told us that whilst he was waiting for Caroline to leave this room, he was standing in the doorway with his back to the room. He was talking to Elsa Greer. That means that she would have been facing him, and that she could see exactly what Caroline was doing over his shoulder. And that she was the only person who could do so. She saw Caroline take that poison. She said nothing, but she remembered it as she sat outside the library window. When Amias Crail came out, she made an excuse of wanting a pullover, and went up to Caroline Crail's room to look for that poison. Women know where other women are likely to hide things. She found it, and being careful not to obliterate any fingerprints or to leave her own, she drew off the fluid into a fountain pen filler. Then she came down again and went off with Crail to the Battery garden, and presently, no doubt, she poured him out some beer, and he tossed it down in his usual way. Meanwhile, Caroline Crail was seriously disturbed. When she saw Elsa come up to the house, this time really to fetch a pullover, Caroline slipped quickly down to the Battery garden and tackled her husband. What he is doing is shameful. She won't stand for it. It's unbelievably cruel and hard on the girl. Amias, irritable at being interrupted, says it's all settled. When the picture is done, he'll send the girl packing. It's all settled. I'll send her packing, I tell you. And then they hear the footsteps of the two blades, and Caroline comes out and, slightly embarrassed, murmurs something about Angela and school and having a lot to do. And by a natural association of ideas, the two men judge the conversation they have overheard refers to Angela, and I'll send her packing becomes I'll see to her packing. And Elsa, pullover in hand, comes down the path, cool and smiling, and takes up the pose once more. She has counted, no doubt, upon Caroline's being suspected and the Conan bottle being found in her room. But Caroline now plays into her hands completely. She brings down some iced beer and pours it out for her husband. Amias tosses it off, making a face, and says, "Everything tastes foul today." Do you not see how significant that remark is? Everything tastes foul. Then there has been something else before that beer that has tasted unpleasant, and the taste of which is still in his mouth. And one other point. Philip Blake speaks of Crail's staggering a little and wonders if he's been drinking. But that slight stagger was the first sign of the Conan working, and that means that it had already been administered to him some time before Caroline brought him the iced bottle of beer. And so, Elsa Green sat on the grey wall and posed. And since she must keep him from suspecting until it was too late, she talked to Amias Crail brightly and naturally. Presently, she saw Meredith on the bench above, and waved her hand to him, and acted her part even more thoroughly for his behalf. And Amias Crail, a man who detested illness and refused to give in to it, painted doggedly on till his limbs failed and his speech thickened, and he sprawled there on that bench, helpless, but with his mind still clear. The bell sounded from the house, and Meredith left the bench to come down to the balcony. I think in that brief moment, Elsa left her place and ran across to the table and dropped the last few drops of the poison into the beer glass that held that last innocent drink. She got rid of the dropper on the path up to the house, crushing it to powder. Then she met Meredith in the doorway. There is a glare there, coming in out of the shadows. Meredith did not see very clearly, only his friend sprawled in a familiar position, and saw his eyes turn from the picture in what he described as a malevolent glare. How much did Amias know or guess? How much his conscious mind knew, we cannot tell. But his hand and his eye were faithful. Hercule Poirot gestured towards the picture on the wall. I should have known when I first saw that picture, for it is a very remarkable picture. It is the picture of a murderess, painted by her victim. It is the picture of a girl watching her lover die. Aftermath. In the silence that followed, a horrified, appalled silence, the sunset slowly flickered away. The last gleam left the window where it had rested on the dark head and pale furs of the woman sitting there. Elsa Dittersham moved and spoke. She said, "Take them away, Meredith. Leave me with Monsieur Poirot." She sat there motionless until the door shut behind them. Then she said, "You are very clever, aren't you?" Poirot did not answer. She said, "What do you expect me to do? Confess?" He shook his head. Elsa said, "Because I shall do nothing of the kind, and I shall admit nothing. But what we say here together does not matter, because it is only a question of your word against mine." "Exactly." "I want to know what you're going to do." Hercule Poirot said, "I shall do everything I can to induce the authorities to grant a posthumous free pardon to Caroline Craig." Elsa laughed. She said, "How absurd. To be given a free pardon for something you didn't do." Then she said, "What about me?" "I shall lay my conclusion before the necessary people. If they decide there is the possibility of making out the case against you, then they may act. I will tell you in my opinion, there is not sufficient evidence. There are only inferences, not facts. Moreover, they will not be anxious to proceed against anyone in your position, unless there is ample justification for such a course." Elsa said, "I shouldn't care. If I were standing in the dock, fighting for my life, there might be something in that. Something alive, exciting. I might enjoy it. Your husband would not." She stared at him. "Do you think I care in the least what my husband would feel? No, I do not. I do not think you have ever in your life cared about what any other person would feel. If you had, you might be happier." She said sharply, "Why are you sorry for me?" "Because, my child, you have so much to learn." "What have I got to learn?" "All of the grown-up emotions. Pity, sympathy, understanding. The only things you know, have ever known, are love and hate." Elsa said, "I saw Caroline take the quinine. I thought she meant to kill herself. That would have simplified things. And then the next morning I found out. He told her that he didn't care a button about me. He had cared, but it was all over. Once he'd finished the picture, he'd send me packing. She'd nothing to worry about, he said. And she was sorry for me. Do you understand what that did to me? I found the stuff, and I gave it to him, and I sat there watching him die. I've never felt so alive, so exultant, so full of power. I watched him die." She flung out her hands. "I didn't understand that I was killing myself, not him. Afterwards I saw her caught in a trap, and that was no good either. I couldn't hurt her. She didn't care. She escaped from it all. Half the time she wasn't there. She and Amias both escaped. They went somewhere where I couldn't get at them. But they didn't die. I died." Elsa Dittisham got up. She went across to the door. She said again, "I died." In the hall, she passed two young people whose life together was just beginning. The chauffeur held open the door of the car. Lady Dittisham got in, and the chauffeur wrapped the fur rug round her knees.